First, I would like to discuss the tragic loss of lives in the strike on the hospital in Kunduz. By way of background, U.S. Special Operations Forces have been providing training, advice, and assistance to Afghan National Defense Forces who had been engaged in a tenacious fight with the Taliban. On Saturday morning, our forces provided close air support to Afghan forces at their request. To be clear, the decision to provide aerial fires was a U.S. decision made within the U.S. chain of command. A hospital was mistakenly struck. We would never intentionally target a protected medical facility. I must allow the investigation to take its course, and therefore I'm not at liberty to discuss further specifics at this time. However, I assure you that the investigation will be thorough, objective, and transparent. I would also like to remind the committee and the American people that we continue to make extraordinary efforts to protect civilians. No military in history has done more to avoid harming innocents. We've readily assumed greater risks to our own forces in order to protect non-combatants. To prevent any future incidents of this nature, I've directed the entire force to undergo in-depth training in order to review all of our operational authorities and rules of engagement. Our record stands in stark contrast to the actions of the Taliban. They've repeatedly violated the laws of war by intentionally targeting civilians. The United Nations attributes more than 70% of the non-combatants killed and wounded in this war to the Taliban.
A little over 4 years after its doors first opened, this Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, was reduced to rubble. Dozens of patients and staff were killed in a devastating US airstrike. The first of the 211 shells was fired at around 2 a.m. in an onslaught that would last almost an hour. In the days that followed, the US military's account of what had happened changed several times. After initially denying the building had been targeted, they then claimed US forces had been under fire before it was announced the Afghan military had called for backup.
Third, Afghan forces advised that they were taking fire from enemy positions and asked for air support from U.S. forces. An airstrike was then called to eliminate the Taliban threat, and several civilians were accidentally struck.
The US military says the hospital was hit as a result of a series of human errors and technical failures, among them electronic malfunctions that prevented messages and onboard video. Afghan officials claim one of their special forces units was being attacked by Taliban fighters from inside the hospital, an account rejected by Doctors Without Borders and some eyewitnesses who say the Taliban were actually in a national security building nearby.
This claim is ridiculous. Our staff has heard no fighting coming from the compound. This compound is guarded, is fenced, and the only patients inside the building were, as I said, patients and staff.
Doctors Without Borders acknowledged it was treating unarmed Taliban fighters, something which itself has previously caused friction with the Afghan military. The attack came a month after Kunduz fell into the Taliban's hands. Concerned about being caught up in the violence in the days before the airstrike, Doctors Without Borders contacted 5 Afghan ministries, the Afghan military, the US Embassy, NATO and the UN to reaffirm the hospital's neutral position, a message which ultimately was not enough to protect itself.
On October 3rd, 2015, one of the most egregious war crimes regarding the U.S. military took place in the Kunduz province in Afghanistan, where 42 people were killed and 30 injured in a hospital airstrike by a U.S. Air Force AC-130. During the course of this video, I will be reading from news articles and files regarding this incident, which is one of many regarding the acts of war crimes, international crimes, and crimes of aggression regarding the U.S. military in the war in Afghanistan. But first, a little background. On September 28, 2015, Taliban militants seized the city of Kunduz, driving out government forces. After the reinforcements arrived, the Afghan army, backed by U.S. air support, began an offensive operation to regain control of the city. After several days of fighting, the Afghan forces claimed to have retaken the city. However, the fighting continued. And on October 3rd, a U.S.-led airstrike struck and badly damaged Kunduz Trauma Center, operated by the Médecins Sans Frontières, which is also known as Doctors Without Borders, an international humanitarian medical non-governmental organization of French origin. Those that were killed were doctors, staff members, and patients. No Taliban were killed here. The Médecins Sans Frontières, or in short, the MSF, had informed all warning parties of the location of the hospital complex. MSF personnel had conducted or contacted U.S. military officials as recently as September 29th to reconfirm the precise location of the hospital. 2 days prior to the attack, Carter Malkasian, advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, emailed MSF asking if the facility had Taliban militants holed up inside. The MSF reported that between 2 and 3 o'clock local time on the night of October 3rd, the organization's Kunduz hospital was struck by a series of aerial bombing raids. The humanitarian organization said the hospital was hit several times during the course of the attack and that the building was partially destroyed. It further said the hospital had been repeatedly and precisely hit and that the attack had continued for another 30 minutes, even after MSF staff contacted U.S. and Afghan officials. The Associated Press reported that U.S. Special Forces were a half a mile away from the hospital at the time of the attack, defending the governor of Kunduz province. Likewise, Afghan forces were also a half mile away. The U.S. military initially said that there had been an airstrike in the area to defend U.S. forces on the ground, and that there may have been collateral damage to a nearby medical facility. On October 15th, NBC Nightly News reported that according to Department of Defense sources, cockpit recordings from the attacking AC-130 gunship reveal that the crew actually questioned whether the airstrike was legal. U.S. and NATO Commander John Campbell later confirmed that a U.S. 130 gunship made the attack on the hospital and that it was a U.S. decision contrary to earlier reports that the strike had been requested by local Afghan forces under Taliban fire. He specified that the decision to use area fire was made within the U.S. chain of command. Campbell said the attack was a mistake and that we would never intentionally target a protected medical facility. White House spokesman John Earnest defended U.S. forces, saying the U.S. Department of Defense goes to great lengths and places a higher premium on avoiding civilian casualties than any other military in the world, and hinted the U.S. may compensate victims and their families. U.S. President Barack Obama apologized to MSF President Joanne Liu for the incident, saying it was a mistake and was intended to target Taliban fighters. The U.S. committed to making condolence payments to the families of the victims and to help with the rebuilding of the hospital. The Afghan Interior Ministry spokesman, Sadiq Siddiqui, confirmed an airstrike on October 3rd, saying that 10 to 15 terrorists were hiding in the hospital and confirming that hospital workers had been killed. However, Médecins Sans Frontières said no Taliban fighters were in the compound. And Christopher Stokes, the general director of the Médecins Sans Frontières Belgium, said in a statement late on October 4th, 2015, that, quote, MSF is disgusted by the recent statements coming from some Afghan government authorities justifying the attack on its hospital in Kunduz. These statements imply that Afghan and U.S. forces working together decided to raze to the ground a fully functioning hospital with more than 180 staff and patients inside because they claim that members of the Taliban were present. This amounts to an admission of a war crime. If there was a major military operation going on there, our staff would have noticed, and that wasn't the case when the strikes occurred, end quote. Also on October 5th, the organization released a statement saying that, quote, their U.S. description of the attack keeps changing from collateral damage to a tragic accident to now attempting to pass responsibility to the Afghanistan government. There can be no justification for this horrible attack, end quote. Days later, media outlets like the Slate would report that indeed this was nothing short of a war crime. In which the Associated Press also reported that before the bombing, U.S. Special Operations analysts have been gathering information on the hospital compound because they believed it was being used by a Pakistan operative to coordinate Taliban activity during the battle for Kunduz. It's not clear whether the crew or the plane or the commander who ordered the attack were aware that this intelligence was being gathered, but it is further evidence that the site was known to U.S. forces as a hospital. The defense officials quoted in the NBC report acknowledged that the call took place, but the information was evidently not passed along to Afghanistan. The legality of the strike came into issue right away. And according to international humanitarian law, attacks on medical facilities are forbidden unless the facilities are being used outside their humanitarian function to commit acts harmful to the enemy. Even if the enemy combatants are inappropriately using the facility for shelter, the rule of proportionality usually forbids such attacks because of the high potential for civilian casualties. Human Rights Watch said the laws of war require the attacking force to issue a warning and wait a reasonable time for a response before attacking a medical unit being misused by combatants. Hospitals in war zones are protected under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Former International Criminal Tribunal prosecutor M. Sharif Bassouni suggested that the attack could be prosecuted as a war crime under the conventions if the attack was intentional or if it represented gross negligence, noting even if it were proven that the Kunduz hospital had lost that right to protection due to infiltration by Taliban, the U.S. military personnel responsible for the attack would have to prove it was a military necessity to strike the hospital. Even if Taliban forces were indeed using it as a human shield, or else claimed that the military was unaware of the hospital's location, risking prosecution for negligence. Nonetheless, Bassouni said, it is unlikely that the case will ever be tried in an international court because the United States is unlikely to turn any of their service members over to an outside body for prosecution, even after facing its own military legal system. Also, just to add, the United States are not co-signers to the Rome Statutes and therefore cannot be held liable in an international court of law. Writing about the attacks where human rights lawyer Jonathan Horowitz noted that under some specific and narrowly tailored conditions, individuals can be attacked even when their actions fall short of carrying weapons or opening fire on the enemy. But this alone does not necessarily justify the attack on a hospital. He emphasized the need for an independent investigation, noting that secrecy from the US and Afghanistan would be damaging to any investigation. The attack made the hospital unusable. All critical patients were referred to other providers, and all MSF staff were evacuated from Kunduz. Before the bombing, the MSF hospital was the only active medical facility in the area. It has been the only trauma center in northeast Afghanistan. In 2014, more than 22,000 patients were treated at this emergency trauma center, and more than 5,800 surgeries were performed. MSF does not ask the allegiance of its patients. However, judging from their patients' clothing and other indications, MSF estimated that of the 105 patients at the time of the attack, between 3 and 4 of the patients were wounded government combatants, while approximately 20 patients were wounded Taliban. MSF's investigation confirmed that the rules in the hospital were implemented and respected, including the no weapons policy. MSF was in full control of the hospital before and at the time of the airstrikes. There were no armed combatants within the hospital compound, and there was no fighting from or in the direct vicinity of the trauma center before the airstrikes. The MSF called for an independent inquiry of the attack on the hospital, accusing the United States of committing a war crime, and called for an international U.S. investigation insufficient. 11 days after the attack, MSF said an American tank entered the hospital. Their unannounced and forced entry damaged property, destroyed potential evidence, and caused stress and fear. The attack smashed the gate of the hospital's complex, and MSF executives who happened to be in the hospital at the time were told that the tank was carrying a U.S. NATO Afghan team investigating the attack. The soldiers were unaware of any remaining MSF staff at the site and were in the process of doing damage assessment. On November 25, 2015, General John Campbell, the American commander in Afghanistan, spoke about the results of the investigation and described the incident as the direct result of avoidable human error and compounded by process and equipment failures. Campbell said that the investigation had showed that the AC-130 gunship crew misidentified the clinic as a nearby Taliban-controlled government building. The American gunship had identified the building based on a visual description from Afghan troops and did not consult their no-strike list, which included the coordinates of the hospital as provided by the staff of the MSF. Electronic equipment malfunctions on the gunship prevented it from accessing email and images, while a navigation error meant its targeting equipment also misidentified the target building. The aircraft fired 211 shells at the building in 29 minutes before American commanders realized the mistake and ordered the attack to stop. According to the report, 12 minutes into the operation, the U.S. military was contacted by MSF, but the faulty electronics on the plane prevented the message from getting through until the attack was over. A final report was released on April 29, 2016, reaffirmed the incident as an accident, and said it thus did not amount to a war crime. 16 members of the U.S. military were disciplined as a result of the investigation, though none were criminally charged. 12 personnel involved in the strike were punished with suspension and removal from command, letters of reprimand, formal counseling, and extensive retraining. The U.S. government said that more than 170 condolence payments were made. $3,000 for wounded people, $6,000 for dead. $5.7 million were set aside for the hospital's reconstruction. According to General Joseph Vogel, commander of the U.S. Central Command, who said in a news briefing following the release of the report, the investigation concluded that certain personnel failed to comply with the rules of engagement and the law of armed conflict. However, the investigation did not conclude that these failures amounted to a war crime. Many victims of the strike in Afghanistan said in interviews that they were unsatisfied with the findings and actions being taken by the United States. Obadullah Nazari, who survived in the basement when his brother died in the attack, said, "There's a lot of talking without much happening. The Obama administration plans to keep 5,000 troops ahead within the area of Afghanistan. much of them counterterrorism operations, training missions, and CIA covert action, including more drone strikes. Later, Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept accused CNN and the New York Times of deliberately obscuring who perpetrated the Afghan hospital attack during the first 36 hours after the airstrike, alleging that their reporting was designed to obfuscate who carried out this atrocity. According to the headliner of the Wall Street Journal, U.S. airstrikes killed 19 at Doctors Without Borders Hospital in Afghanistan, under which appears this equally clear lead. Quote, a U.S. airstrike in the Afghan city of Kunduz killed at least 19 people at a hospital run by international medical aid organization Doctors Without Borders early Saturday, prompting condemnation from humanitarian groups and the United Nations. End quote. However, CNN and the New York Times did not report on the incident honestly. So what do we make of this specific incident and the hundreds like it? Well, we prosecute people who report on war crimes. People such as Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and other whistleblowers to government malfeasance, such as former senior executive Thomas Drake, former NSA crypto analyst William Binney, former NSA employee Kirk J. Wiebe, and Ed Loomis. The Obama administration would end up jailing more whistleblowers than all the previous administrations combined, leading many to think and wonder, who is the real terrorist? Was it the Taliban in Afghanistan? Was it Al-Qaeda in Iraq? Or was it the United States?